So, a warm good evening and welcome. My name is Sheena, and I'm part of the Wellspring Calgary team. We are so pleased you could join us for tonight's speaker section, Living Your Best with Advanced Metastatic, Chronic, or Non-Curable Cancer. Care to share how to communicate best with the people who matter most with Dr. Dana Mail. We proudly provide this program in partnership with Cancer Care Alberta, Wellspring Edmonton, and Wellspring Calgary. We are so happy to have Dr. Dana Mail with us this evening. Dana is a registered psychologist in the Department of Psychosocial Oncology at the Tom Baker Cancer Centre in Calgary, Alberta. She's passionate about supporting people to find their own authentic ways to cope and live better with the effects of cancer through individual, family, and couples counseling, group programs, and speaking at events just like this one. So a warm welcome to you, Dana, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sheena, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I just wanted to see, Sheena, should I go ahead with my presentation, or do we want to have any other introductions or anything before I?
You can jump right in and share your screen. Sure, Dana, thanks.
Great. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Can, thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, good evening, everyone. Regardless of what time zone you're joining from here today, I appreciate you sharing your time with me and attention and allowing me the opportunity to share something that I care a lot about, which is how to communicate best with the people who matter to us. And whether you're living with cancer yourself or supporting someone who is, this presentation is really intended to be equally applicable and useful to anybody in the audience here today. And this is really because, as we know, relationships are built on give and take and really a back and forth communication. So as a registered psychologist with the Tom Baker Cancer Center, I have the privilege of working with people living with cancer and their loved ones. And what I often witness is that each person in a relationship or a family is often thinking about and affected by the same things and really wishing the best for one another, but sometimes aren't really sure how or whether it's okay to talk about what is on their mind or their heart. As human beings, we're fundamentally concerned with maintaining our relationships. We depend on them. And so if we believe that saying something might jeopardize our connection with others or bring them some sort of pain in some way, we will do whatever we think we must to stay close to those people. And even if that means keeping our thoughts and feelings to ourselves sometimes. The problem with that, though, is that we can end up spending so much energy trying not to talk about things that it actually takes away from the relationship and being able to connect over things that most often are on everyone's mind anyways. The reality is when people can safely and effectively communicate, there's often a great sense of relief that comes from not needing to keep it to ourselves, and we build intimacy and closeness with the people that we've shared with. So the tips that I'm going to be sharing with you today are meant to serve as a guide for how to communicate with care so that we can really be open and honest about what's going on for me as an individual in a way that doesn't threaten or cause damage to the we or the relationship. And things that I hope you take away from this talk are ideas of how to improve feelings of connection, greater understanding and appreciation in your relationships, whether that's with friends, family, or even healthcare providers, and maybe some tips for difficult conversations, as well as how to get what you need from the people who are there and want to help. So communication is a really important yet loaded word. And I think we can all agree that it is essential to healthy, fulfilling relationships, and yet it's quite a complex topic. How we show up matters, and we've probably all heard the saying, it's not just about what you say, it's how you say it. So we can think about our interactions with people like sharing a meal with someone. The quality of that meal, our level of satisfaction with the experience will depend on a number of things: the setting and the ambiance, the ingredients that go into the meal, the care and planning that go into the process, the company we're in, and our own mood or state of being at the time. It would be foolish to expect that we would feel satisfied with a meal that was tossed together last minute, carelessly, without much planning or thoughtfulness about what ingredients we prefer, especially if we show up cranky and starving. And likewise, we can't expect to feel satisfied with our interactions with others if we aren't intentional, aware of and making clear our preferences, plan ahead to some degree, and give proper care and attention to the process. So if there's one message you take away from this entire talk this evening, I hope that it's what you get out of relationships is what you put in. And so if you're not getting out what you want or expecting and want more, it's a good place to start by giving more. So if we keep thinking about communication like cooking or dining, I thought it could help to approach this with a guiding recipe for success. And this recipe that I'm going to share is made up of 5 W's. So who, where, when, why, and what, to help frame things, sprinkled in with some strategies for the how to put this all into action. And you'll see I put the word success here in quotes because there really is no perfect outcome when it comes to communication. Like cooking, it can be messy. And even when we have clear directions, the actual execution and finished product can look and taste wildly different. So the good news is that communication is a skill that we can keep developing over time with practice. And I want to take a moment here before we get too far into things to just say, it's really important to remember that everybody is so different and we can all have very different reactions to the same situation. So whereas someone may feel hurt that a friend didn't ask about an appointment, for example, somebody else could feel really bothered by somebody asking about that. And so throughout this talk, I invite you to keep that in mind, to try to take away general principles or tips, but know that there really isn't any normal or right way to feel or react, and that one approach may not always work with the same person even. And this is really why communication has to be an ongoing process and a practice, because the different people in our lives will think and feel and respond differently, just as we ourselves will think, feel, and respond differently depending on the day or the situation. So communication is not a one-time deal. It's something to keep practicing over time with patience. So the first stop on our roadmap or recipe here is to think about who we want to have this communication with. So I've put some examples up here. It might be a family member or perhaps a whole family at large. So that's something to consider. Is it one individual member or a group kind of conversation? Is it one particular friend or our whole circle of support that we want to share something with? And maybe when it comes to providers, trying to identify who is the right provider to have this particular conversation with. So if it's information-based, identifying who is the most expert on the topic. If it's about my health in general, maybe not specific to cancer care, it might be my family physician. And maybe if there's medication involved in the question, I might want to consider talking with a pharmacist. Once we've identified who that communication is meant to be with, it's important to try to empathize and sensitize ourselves to that person and their preferred style or preferences, and try to tailor our way of interacting with them in a way that they will best be able to hear us. So in the case of a healthcare provider, for example, let's say meeting with your oncologist, you might consider what you know about previous communication with that person. So maybe for some of you, your oncologist tends to take all the time that you need and proactively asks if you have questions before you leave. Perhaps for others, over time, you've noticed that the appointments can go quite quickly and you don't always get invited to ask questions, but there's been something on your mind that you've been meaning to ask. And so with this particular provider, you know that probably you're going to have to find a way to raise this question yourself. And so what can you empathize with? Well, maybe thinking about the fact that your oncologist is quite busy, often pressed for time, and maybe that if something is introduced unexpectedly, that this might cause them to feel pressured or flustered. And so how can we be sensitive to that? Maybe preparing a written list of questions to bring so that you can ask for what you need clearly and succinctly. And also that list might serve as a visual cue to let the provider know there's something on your mind you'd like to address. So we'll get into more specific strategies, but just generally starting, who is the conversation with and what do I need to keep in mind about this person? Next, we want to consider when we might have this conversation. And so today we might consider, is this best an in-person conversation, or might it be possible or maybe even enhanced actually by being over the phone or using video, much like we're using right now. We might, where, not when. While doing an activity, we might consider, some people find it more comfortable to have difficult conversations or conversations in general while doing things like going on a walk or a drive or some shared activity of some sort. And that can take some of the pressure off, looking directly at each other, or feeling like you have to be really serious about what's coming up. It's really important to be in a place where there are minimal distractions, and depending on the conversation, of course, thinking about whether you have privacy or not being interrupted. In some situations, the where might be predetermined. There might only be one opportunity, and that might be, for example, at a medical appointment. And then also thinking about whether we need to have this conversation in a safe, contained space where we have a set time limit and maybe a mediator or some professional support depending on the topic. So for example, connecting with a counselor in our Department of Psychosocial Oncology. We also want to think about when is the best time to have this conversation, and whether it might be a one-time conversation that there's a fairly straightforward resolution to, or whether it's something that we want to plan to bring up to start, but then have an ongoing conversation and coming back to that. So we can actually, plan to maybe just talk for an hour to start and then check in over time. Also important to pick a time when you don't have other plans or demands, when you're awake and can give your focused attention. And it might also be good to think about the bigger picture. So with certain conversations that may be on your mind, but it may not feel like the right time to have them just yet. For example, you may have questions about things like advanced care planning. For example, what is palliative care? How would I access more information or services? And that might be a conversation that you start just by gathering information, talking to a healthcare provider about. But maybe there's also an opportunity to continue that conversation with loved ones and invite them to participate in, and over time revisiting those topics. It's also okay to say that you need more time or are not ready to have a certain conversation. And so we also need to respect if somebody else is not ready to have that conversation with us. And if that's the case, it can be helpful to ask or express that you might not be ready, or what could help you feel more ready. And also important to recognize that for some topics, we may never feel ready. So in which case we may have to make a decision. Are we willing to have that hard conversation anyways with a bit of support and patience? Or if we're unwilling, it's important that we be honest about that and allow the other person to accept that we may not be able to be a part of that conversation and to proceed without us. So next up in the recipe here is considering the why of the communication. So this is the intention or the motivator behind the conversation, the reason it's important to talk in the first place. And the why is what we can come back to when or if the communication gets off the rails, or if we find ourselves going in circles, or maybe even putting off having the conversation at all. So for example, we might really feel like we need to have a certain conversation because if we don't learn to give people feedback and learn to say no about something, for example, that we're, maybe at risk of letting ourselves down over time and not taking best care of ourselves. Maybe it's that, I really care about this person and want to know how to support them better. And that's really important to me and worth having perhaps an uncomfortable conversation about. Maybe it's that, realizing my health is so important to me that I need to learn how to advocate for myself better with my healthcare team. So a really important thing to be clear about, and really what makes the communication intentional. And so coming back to our cooking analogy, a pretty important of that process is to decide what we are cooking. In this case, we want to be really clear first with ourselves so that we can be clear with the other party about what we're hoping to achieve through this communication. And there are many aims to communication, but I've tried to put together just a short menu of options here that can serve as a guide. So maybe what we want is to make some sort of request for help or support. We might be looking to learn how to set boundaries or say no to something. Maybe I'm dissatisfied with something that's happening, or there's something that could help me even more, and I would like to give some feedback about that in a gentle way. And then maybe on the other side of that interaction, it might be hard to receive feedback, and I want to learn ways to take this in and respond more constructively. So we've covered the 5 W's and we've arrived at the how. So this is, now that we're clear on who we plan to communicate with, when, where, for what reasons, we're going to look at some specific tools or strategies for how to navigate the conversation. Generally speaking, people want to do better, be in connection, and be happy. And yet many of us were not taught all of the communication skills that may be required all of the time. Often we were taught skills that worked in one setting, for example, in our families that we grew up in, likely served us very well then, but may not always be cutting it anymore, even if it does work most of the time still. And so we can always learn more skills so that we're better able to deal with a variety of situations, especially ones that are new or uncertain, or may require talking about things we aren't used to. So when it comes to that first what of communication that we just covered, the one aimed at making a request. So there are some guidelines that can help our chances of being heard and responded to in the way that we'd like. It's very important to be specific about what you're asking for, and if possible, defining this as a behavior. So for example, rather than saying, I'd like you to help out more around the house, we're likely to be more effective if we can specify, I would really like if you could stay on top of the dishes and laundry. It's important to ask with confidence and also without apology. After all, your needs and wishes are very valid. And also try to be clear and brief. So making one request at a time or per conversation. Another thing that can be helpful is to consider whether your request can be framed as a positive rather than a negative or a criticism. So we know that people are much more motivated by positive rewards than they are by negative outcomes. And so, for example, rather than saying, you never do the dishes and I need you to do better, consider, when I see the dishes piled up, I feel stressed. I would really appreciate if you could help keep on top of the dishes day to day. That would make me feel happy and more relaxed. And so that brings us to the final tip here, which is sometimes, especially if it's not our first time making the request, it can be helpful to add a description of the outcome or consequence. So in this last example, a positive outcome was described, that I might feel more supported and relaxed if my request is met. But sometimes when we've been unsuccessful in our initial requests, we might have more success by stating a negative consequence. So for example, I've asked a couple times now for help with dishes and they continue to pile up. If this continues, I have to do the dishes myself, I'm going to be more tired and I won't have the energy to stay up and maybe watch that movie we wanted to watch, and just in general might feel more stressed and less pleasant to be around. So it is important that if you're going to include a consequence, though, it has to be something that you're prepared to follow through on. Otherwise, the person learns that there really isn't a consequence after all. And frankly, sometimes from their perspective, no real reason to do differently if the way that it is suits them just fine. For many of us, it can be hard to know what we need, and that's important when we're making requests. So people may ask how they can help, and you're maybe not so sure, or perhaps they don't ask, but assume you want one kind of support, and it seems that you're really looking for something else. I'm gonna see if I can play this video, and hopefully the sound works. Oops. Maybe not.
Dana, let me help you. So if you stop sharing your screen, when there you go. And then when you go to share it again, you're gonna make sure you click on the little box at the bottom left that says share sound and optimize for video clip, and that should help you.
Okay. Thank you, Sheena.
That's what I'm here for.
I wonder. Nope, that might not be working. Let me try one more thing and then I'm gonna give up.
You're welcome if there's a link, Dana, to put it in the chat and I can try to share it.
Thanks everyone for your patience. Okay, I'm gonna try direct from the source.
It's just, there's all this
Is there
pressure,
volume with that?
you know?
Yes.
And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail out.
See, you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you.
Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
Okay, so hopefully that was worth trying to figure out. I liked that video. I'm gonna try to get my screen back up and going here. Oops. Okay. So many of us may be able to relate to that video, or that the experience of maybe looking for one type of support and receiving another, or trying our best to be helpful in one way, but it doesn't seem to have the desired effect. So whether you're the one wanting support or the person wanting to offer support, it can be helpful to consider these 4 categories, which can be broken down into emotional support, informational, practical, or what is sometimes called instrumental support, and companionship or comfort. And so some examples starting with that emotional type of support include things like active listening, maybe asking questions to show that we're giving lots of attention and are interested, or we want to understand, using our body language, keeping eye contact, nodding, leaning closer, and expressing validation, saying things like, I hear you, I understand, offering encouragement, maybe saying to your person that we're going to get through this, and acknowledging, maybe just letting the person you're thinking of them and not needing to offer a whole lot more. On the other hand, sometimes people actually do want some fixing or solutions or information. And so that can look like seeking out information to better understand a problem, asking questions and getting answers. It could look like trying to find what kinds of other help or support might be available. And there is a place for advice or guidance if that's welcome as well, and what the person is looking for. It might also be about having somebody share updates on your behalf and taking that off of your plate to have to do. When it comes to practical support, there are lots of things that can be helpful. For example, giving people drives or bringing them meals or groceries, helping with errands or tasks around the house. Maybe it's, making reminders for somebody's medication or filling prescriptions. And sometimes it is about giving gifts or money or cards, and that can mean a lot to people as well. And lastly, not to underestimate the value of just being there, right? And just offering your company to somebody. It can be physical touch if that feels right for somebody. It can be attending appointments with them, watching a show or a movie being a distraction at times, not talking about anything related to cancer at all. It could be enjoying a meal together. And so if you are unsure of what you might be needing sometimes or what somebody is needing of you, it might be helpful to consider these 4 categories, or maybe even just ask directly, what type of support are you looking for in this moment? And on that note, I just want to share a resource. Some of you may be familiar with this, but if not, it is a nice, potentially very useful one. Caringbridge is a website that you can use to share health updates or information, or assign certain kinds of support that you're looking for at that time, all in one place, so that you don't have to repeat information or have duplicate offers being made. So I really recommend that one. So the other what of what we might be trying to achieve in our communication is maybe how to say no. So most of us are really comfortable and content being helpful, agreeable, taking lots on, and we might actually hold a lot of pride in being kind, helpful, and we might actually believe that saying no means we're being selfish or unkind, and we might feel a lot of guilt about this. Saying no might also come with feelings of grief or sadness, such as when we are unable to do things that we once were, and that can be a real loss. For many reasons, societally, based on what we learned growing up and more, it can be very hard for many people to say no. And yet, if we don't learn this important skill and how to let others down, sometimes we miss out on important opportunities to say yes to ourselves or the things that matter most, and we risk letting ourselves down over time. Some examples of saying no might be, saying no, thank you, not this time, but please keep asking. If somebody invites you to an event, but you don't feel like you have the energy or it's not a priority at that time. It might mean saying no to a healthcare provider who suggests something you're not comfortable with or need more information about, and may not be ready to pursue. As a support person, saying no can look like, no, I can't help with that this time. I need some time for me or for other things. So how to do this? It is important to try, even if you don't feel confident, to try to appear confident. So, keeping your head and chest up, sounding relaxed, keeping eye contact, focusing on your breathing, taking your time as well to be clear in advance on what is a yes and what is a no, what you will and won't do. And if you get asked to do something and you're not sure if you're prepared to say yes, that it's okay to say, I need more time to think about that. Also, it's funny how often we make an offer out of thinking somebody is wanting us to do something before they've even asked. And so waiting for that invitation also before volunteering. Not apologizing or justifying when we say no, that we just have the right and it speaks for itself. And also anticipating that we might get some pushback and we might need to repeat our message, and even sounding a bit like a broken record and not needing to change our response, but just repeating it is just fine. And then accepting the consequences that come with saying no. So just like we have the right to say no, others have the right to not like it. Sometimes the thing we need to communicate about is giving someone some gentle feedback about something they've said or done, or something we want them to adjust. But we worry about upsetting the other person, making it awkward, or getting too uncomfortable or emotional. For example, maybe there is something on your mind that your oncologist might be able to help you with, but you're worried it's not your place to ask. You might be taking up too much of their time. Maybe worried that they'll take your question or feedback as a sign you're not happy with their care. On the flip side, maybe you're a support person and there's something you want to share or ask the person you're supporting, but you're worried about how they might take it. And sometimes just the not knowing of where the conversation might go is enough to make us want to put it off. And as I mentioned before, as human beings, our relationships are paramount to us, especially when it comes to coping with cancer. We literally depend on our people for our care and our well-being. And so if we believe a conversation could threaten that relationship, no wonder that can feel too risky. The problem is if we don't risk naming the elephant in the room or that thing that's on our mind eating away at us, then we risk something else. We risk feeling disconnected, feeling more alone, maybe losing out on potential support and care and an opportunity to enrich our relationships and our lives. And either way, the elephant is still there. And so if we can find the courage to name that elephant, we may find a great sense of relief and maybe even inspire those around us to practice being courageous with us in turn, to name their fears, their hopes, their values. So while giving and receiving feedback can feel like one of the trickiest types of conversations, if approached with care and some strategies in mind, it can actually strengthen the relationship and increase feelings of satisfaction, appreciation, and closeness. So let's look at a couple of examples that can commonly arise. So one is that feeling of dissatisfaction maybe with an aspect of your care. So one woman that I work with who has graciously given me her permission to use this example shared that she receives regular injections as part of her treatment plan. And although she is quite fond of her nurse who administers the shots, she is not so fond of the nurse's technique. This woman has learned through talking with other people on the same treatment, and she's very good at doing her own research. And so she's learned that there are not only gentler ways of doing the injection, for example, changing body posture, injecting different parts of the body, but she also learned that by taking out the medication vial from the refrigerator well enough in advance and letting it warm to room temperature, before injecting, that can also help not only with it going in more comfortably into the body, but actually that there might be some research suggesting it enhances the delivery of the treatment throughout the body as it is less sticky, as she describes it, when it's warmer and less thick. So although she feels very confident in those facts, she feels less confident in her ability to ask her nurse to change her approach. And this is because she doesn't want to offend her nurse, understandably, who has been in the profession for a very long time, has a lot of experience and knowledge. And, you know, this woman is understandably worried that giving her this feedback and asking her to change her long-standing method might compromise her relationship with that provider. And it's a relationship that is very important to her. Another common experience is when someone feels offended, hurt, or generally displeased as a result of maybe some remarks or questions that were well-intended, but came across as maybe being insensitive. So for example, people saying, oh, just think positive, or at least, and going on to highlight some positive aspect of otherwise a really difficult situation. Maybe referring to other people's experiences, trying to relate, but maybe leaving the person feeling a bit misunderstood or invalidated. Even questions sometimes as seemingly straightforward as asking, you know, when someone might be returning to work. I hear this one often. That can sometimes be experienced as a source of stress or pressure rather than support. So if you find yourself on the receiving end of comments or reactions or actions that are unwelcome or unhelpful, it might be worth giving some corrective feedback. And this doesn't have to be a criticism or something negative. The key is directing the person toward how they can help us. And that really implies that we believe they can help us, that they are capable. So here are some tips for how we can practice and develop this skill. One is to really give some thought and care before speaking, maybe even writing some ideas down, like a sort of script, whether you actually end up using that script when speaking with the person or not, just the act of writing your ideas down, figuring out what you want to say, how you might rephrase something, that can be really helpful for a lot of people. And also trying to put it into a couple, you know, brief statements can help us really zero in on what's the most important part. You might want to open also by naming the awkwardness, possibly if it is an awkward conversation. Another client of mine shared with me that she likes to use humor to diffuse these kinds of situations, and we'll just name it really candidly, just saying, well, this is awkward, and then kind of going forward with the thing that's still really important to say, even though it's not so comfy to talk about. It can also be really helpful to lead with the positive. So what about the relationship you appreciate? What what their support means to you, and focusing on what you do want from them rather than naming all the things that you don't want. So for example, you could say to someone who might have just said something that rubbed you the wrong way, I appreciate that you're trying to be encouraging and your support is really valuable to me. I would feel even more encouraged and supported though if you could just listen and let me feel whatever I'm feeling, positive or negative. It can also be important to give this kind of feedback when we're one-to-one without anybody around us. Generally speaking, it's hard enough to receive feedback like this without other people watching and being a part of that process. Also choosing our timing, right? So being mindful of, does the person have the capacity or space to hear this right now? It also is usually more effective to share our own personal experience rather than advice or shoulds. So although it can feel safer to put our feedback into a suggestion or advice, so for example, with the woman's example with the injection, asking the nurse, have you considered taking it out of the vial sooner to let it warm up, right? That might be one way to ask or hint that we would find that helpful. But the problem with that is that advice or suggestions can be easily resisted, and it's much harder to disagree with or counter somebody's personal experience. So just saying, I would really prefer if you would warm the medication before you inject it is more likely to be accommodated. Also really important to comment on behavior and not the person's character. After all, the point of feedback is that the person is actually able to change something. And then also keeping in mind that even though you have been maybe thinking about this feedback for some time, the other person likely hasn't. And so expect that they may not have an immediate reaction and might need a bit of time to absorb the message, to really think it through. So not being surprised if somebody gets a bit quiet or even defensive initially, but maybe just giving that some time. So now talking about on the receiving end of that feedback, it can be tough hearing something that we did had maybe a negative effect on somebody that we care about. And yet feedback is a real opportunity to grow both personally and grow the relationship. So we can ask ourselves when we're receiving hard feedback, what can I learn here? Consider this an opportunity to do better. And, we really do all grow through trial and error or making mistakes. So trying to have a bit of grace and compassion for ourselves. Also remembering that constructive feedback about my behavior is not a reflection of me as a person. And it can be helpful to think of times when maybe we've wanted to provide some correction to somebody's behavior, and it didn't mean that we respected the person less or liked them less. Try to accept the feedback. And if we're unable to do that, take some time to try that on and let it sink in rather than reacting defensively. If the feedback is valid and you agree with it, really try to take accountability, right? And just saying something like, yep, I can see that that is the case. You might even say, thanks for letting me know or for raising that with me. If we are not sure if we agree or it doesn't seem so clear to us what the feedback is, then it can be helpful to ask for more details. So in what way do you feel that I've done that or been unsupportive, for example? And also, we don't have to wait to be given feedback in order to receive it. So if you're unsure if you're being as helpful as you can be, or you sense that maybe there's been a misunderstanding or something feels off with this person, you can always invite feedback, right? And just say, maybe I'm aware I've been making some suggestions. I'm not sure actually though, is that so helpful right now? Or is there something that you'd like to say to me? I feel like things are a bit tense. So inviting that can also be really appreciated or reassuring if there's nothing in turn. It doesn't hurt to ask. So if anybody's interested in more tips or strategies on communication, I'm sharing this resource as well. And I think Sheena will share some of this information tomorrow as well after this talk. And so don't feel like you need to write it all down, but this is a self-help resource through the Centre for Clinical Interventions, and it's offered by the Government of Western Australia, but it's a really wonderful self-help website. There's a whole workbook with 10 modules that you can work through at your own pace around what they refer to here as assertive communication. So more strategies there. So we really can't talk about communication without talking about vulnerability. And some of you may be familiar with Brene Brown. She's a clinical social worker and research professor at the University of Houston, who's been studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy for, I think, over 20 years. And this is a quote from a book of hers, Rising Strong. She says, "Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage." Now, in my work, I would say some of the conversations that require the greatest courage and vulnerability are those when people step into what are often their most painful or scary experiences. So for some, it might be naming a fear of dying. It might be asking for information about advanced care planning, including hospice care or medical assistance in dying. It might be about the significant losses or grief that come along with something like advanced cancer. For healthcare providers, it might be sharing difficult medical news or inviting a discussion about end-of-life planning. And it takes immense courage to explore these topics and others with ourselves, with healthcare professionals, and perhaps most especially with loved ones who are most closely affected and invested in these experiences and the decisions around them. You may recall the classic trust fall. If you're like me, you have memories of being a kid playing with your friends, and you'd each take turns closing your eyes and falling backward, believing but not knowing whether your friend would be there to catch you as you fall. And as we grow up and stop playing games like this, vulnerability no longer looks like closing our eyes and falling backward, but it does look like speaking our mind and sharing what's on our heart and asking for help, trusting that the person will show up and hold space for us and receive our message. And this is a pretty powerful process, and really to me speaks to what an immense privilege it is to be on the receiving end of that vulnerability. So next time somebody in your life comes to you with something important on their mind or heart, remember that to start that conversation took vulnerability. And even if the conversation is one of disappointment or it comes with some feedback that might be hard to hear, consider this, that that person's vulnerable share is a gesture that they value their relationship with you. There is currently enough trust and care there that they feel you are worth having that uncomfortable, awkward, or maybe even outright risky conversation with. They're letting you know, even though I feel exposed and there is no guarantee that I won't get hurt, I care enough about you and us to take that risk, and I choose to stick my neck out with the hope and belief that you're safe to do this with. In order to have productive conversations and stay in them, we need to be able to keep feeling relatively okay with being out of our comfort zone. So the key to this is staying connected. And as I've mentioned, communication, especially when practiced in unfamiliar ways, can bring up lots of uncomfortable feelings. Sometimes those feelings can make it hard to stay in the conversation and feel connected. So we might start to feel frustrated or hopeless, hurt, shut down. We might want to walk away, raise our voice. We might even say things we don't mean. And when this happens, we need to pause. So strong emotions or physical sensations, maybe it's flushing or getting tense in our body. This is our body's way of signaling that the engine is too hot. And if we proceed, we may do damage. So taking this as a sign that we might need to stop, ground, and reset before continuing forward, which can look like connecting with ourselves, with the world around us, or with each other. To ground with ourselves, we can focus on our breath. There's lots of resources and supports to help practice and learn meditation and breathing techniques to center ourselves. One of my favorite ways is to engage the 5 senses by naming things that we can see around us: touch, hear, taste, and smell. It's pretty hard to be kind of up in our head thinking about things when we're really getting in touch with those senses and our immediate surroundings. We can also distract with another task momentarily, or maybe for a longer period. And if we are taking a break, it's really important to actually take a break. So not just walk away, but keep stewing and replaying the conversation in our head or preparing for round 2 in our minds. It really needs to be a true break to be effective. In terms of grounding with the person that we might be in a conversation with, you can pause on talking and just give your body a moment to reset. If you're someone who's soothed by physical contact, you might extend a hand outward. Or as one couple I work with likes to do, they link their pinkies together. And to get the most out of this, really try to pay attention, if you're trying this, to the physical feeling, right? Notice the warmth of the person's hand, or what does it feel like to just have my body resting on this seat right now? Does it feel rough or smooth? Just letting our nervous system kind of calm and tune into the senses again. If touch isn't your thing, maybe just saying I need a break, or finding a code word like mango, anything random that just signals that you need a break, and maybe just sitting quietly and taking some deep breaths together. Humor can also be very effective for a lot of people. And also it can help to come back to that why that we talked about. What was the initial intention of this conversation, right? Maybe we lost sight of that, but let's just come back. And so maybe it's saying something like, I'm feeling pretty frustrated right now. I'm not sure how we even got here. But really, it's still important to me that I've been feeling concerned, and I really want your help with this. And even when we're feeling guarded, defensive, angry, or hurt, it can be helpful to try to remember that there is a part of us, and always in the other person, that is really just looking for connection, love. And it can be incredibly hard, but worthwhile to try to turn toward the other person from that part of ourselves. Can we take that risk and say, I'm feeling pretty scared or hurt right now, and I still need you or want you to help me. Are you here with me? So returning to our cooking analogy and that recipe roadmap we started with, we've navigated our way through the kitchen, starting at who, going through where, when, why, what, and hopefully picked up some tools for how to make it to this final outcome. And maybe we've found ourselves somewhere in between this ideal outcome and reality. Wherever you land in your efforts to communicate best with your people who matter the most to you, a little bit of sweetness goes a long way. So I think it's important to comment on this too. Intentional communication and practicing vulnerability is incredibly hard work. And the hope is that you're both left feeling closer, it's been constructive, you feel more understood. All of that hopefully makes you feel like your effort was worthwhile, and maybe even leaves you feeling a bit more confident to keep trying these ways of communicating. And it still doesn't hurt to directly acknowledge the other person's effort for the way that they showed up. And even when you didn't end up where you wanted to, or maybe you only got part of the way, acknowledging or thanking one another for something that you appreciate the other did during that conversation, or more generally, can really be a nice way of solidifying the relationship, coming out on the other side feeling like you're in this together still as a team. So for example, maybe just saying, I really appreciate that you were open to talking with me about this. Thanks for finding the time with everything that's been going on. I feel closer to you, if that's true, right? Or even if you don't add that feeling closer, just that I appreciate that we tried this here today. And so on that note, I want to also express a heartfelt thank you all for joining this event and sharing your time and attention with me. It really was a treat preparing for this conversation with you all, and I'm looking forward to some questions and discussion. And really, we all exist in relationship, and the better we learn to communicate with the people in our lives and they learn to communicate with us, the better lives we live together. So thank you.
Thank you, Dana. And we are so happy to share as well that we have asked somebody with lived experience to share their communication story before we jump into kind of any questions or answers. And so I'd like to welcome Jackie to this program. Jackie, we'd love you if you don't already have your camera on and unmute yourself to introduce yourself and to please share your experience with us with great thank you.
Hi. How does it work to get on this?
Say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can't ask me.
Can you hear me now?
We sure can. We sure can.
Good. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jackie. I've been invited to speak to you tonight about my cancer experiences. I love to garden. I love cats, and I especially love to do for others. I'm generally confident. I tell it like it is, but through my 30-year cancer journey, I've struggled to find ways to express myself to those people who matter the most to me. That'd be my family, my friends, and my health team. In 1990, I began my cancer journey. 4 cancers later, I began to question why I had so many different cancers. In 2015, I discovered I had BRCA2, a gene that causes ovarian and breast cancers. I was told the chance of me getting these cancers was too risky not to take action. Therefore, I underwent a bilateral mastectomy, a hysterectomy, and a oophorectomy. I intended to fight for a long life, rich with love, support, and happiness. Regardless of my efforts, in 2019, I was diagnosed with my 5th and final cancer, stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. I was angry knowing I had a cancer I wasn't going to beat. I hurt knowing I'd be leaving my family with broken hearts. I felt ugly because I had mutilated my body to prevent a cancer that came back anyway. I was certain my previous health team had missed signs of a reoccurrence, but I didn't know how to communicate my fears and frustrations, so I felt alone and I trusted no one. While learning how to talk to others about how angry I was, eventually I forgave myself and my health team. I've learned to talk about my feelings and concerns in a tone that's no longer offensive, yet it's still direct and it gets results. I don't worry about speaking my mind because I'm worth having a cancer team that embraces hope and believes I'm worth their best efforts, and I have that team. Cancer is not my only battle. I also have Crohn's, type 2 diabetes, daily headaches, and depression. I need to remember to make problems or concerns with these diseases known to my healthcare team in order to live the best life I can. Being able to ask for what I need from my health team helps me bravely ask difficult questions. For example, in 2020, my cancer metastasized to my brain and the tumor continued to grow. Last winter, it grew 2 centimeters and everyone panicked. I lost trust with my surgeon, so I asked his secretary to explain the process of creating a treatment plan. I learned my surgeon consults with 3 other surgeons, and as a team, they create the treatment plan. I was so relieved, and all it took was the confidence to ask a difficult question. When possible, I never meet with my health team alone. It's difficult to listen, make notes, and ask them questions without forgetting something. I take a support person who is always able to write quickly while taking appointment notes and who can read my notes and remind me of the questions I wanted to ask or the prescriptions I needed to refill. It wasn't easy, but I've learned the importance of our family being open about our feelings and worries. Honesty gave all of us tools we needed to move forward and deal with emotions we face every day. We discussed plans about end of life, hospice care, and how living with cancer affects us all. My 95-year-old parents and siblings are in Ontario. I need them in my life, and they feel guilty being so far away. So I use Zoom, FaceTime calls, and travel when possible to stay in touch. This way, I stay connected with family I'm close to, even though they are so far away. My son moved to Fort McMurray 5 months ago, and I worried I wouldn't be able to let him know how much he was loved. Through planned phone calls and visits, we now discuss our fears and needs with each other. We've been able to find happiness, and there are no secrets. I discovered open, honest conversations with my family helped all of us, and I've learned sharing bad news is as important as sharing good. It's also about learning to cry in front of them and remembering to tell them it's okay to do the same. One afternoon, my daughter saw me crying. Being an empathetic young woman with disabilities, she comforted me in her own ways. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and sat with me for a while holding my hand. She taught me we don't always need to share our feelings with words, as actions can be just as powerful. My greatest struggle has been learning how to ask my support team to give more when they are already overwhelmed with the amount of their time I need. Caregivers like my husband are so important to my well-being. I try to encourage him to talk to me about his feelings, and we sought out counseling. He loves lists and has started letting us know how much he does by asking if anyone can take actions off that list. This allows us to help him lessen his workload and make space for him to relax and do things he enjoys. His lists are his way of communicating. Talking about feelings and fears can be scary. Whether I need to ask for help or my friends want to ask questions, it's not always easy to know what or how to say something. I was ignored by 2 women recently whom I've known for years. When I asked them why, they said, "We didn't know what to say to you. We were afraid if we asked how you were doing, we'd hear bad news." I'm so glad I chose to ask them about their behaviors because our friendships have been rekindled and we've learned how to talk about the difficult things. When friends ask what they can do for me, I try to be as direct as I can. If I ask for soup, I could end up with something I wouldn't enjoy. But if I ask for a non-spicy vegetable soup with no mushrooms or peppers, I'm more likely to receive something I know I'll enjoy. I may crave sweets, but I'm not allowed to have many. If I visit with a friend, I try to remember to mention that ahead of time. I'm more likely to see a veggie tray for snacks that I can enjoy guilt-free. Don't be embarrassed to ask for things you need. Just be specific. One time, friends bought me a monthly parking pass. What a unique gift, and one I hadn't thought I needed until I had it. At that moment, and through many food deliveries since, my friends have continued to express their thoughtfulness and love for me through gifts. I've discovered many ways to let others know how I'm feeling. One of my favorites is by writing poetry. Poetry is a powerful method I use to reach others and help express my thoughts. I've learned to express feelings and thoughts with those in my life in equal parts of what's on my mind and on theirs. When both you and the person you're with take turns talking, you both benefit. However, my most powerful communication skill is that of listening. Thank you for your time tonight. I hope that in hearing some of my story, you'll feel inspired to take action and find more communication techniques. Cancer has created a need for us to be with caring people. So I encourage you to reach out, be brave, and if you haven't already done this, create a circle of support people who matter most to you. Thank you.
Jackie, thank you. Wow, that was powerful. Tons of learning there. And I just have to say how connected. I know that you and Dana did not hear each other's talk before you both shared it, but I just felt so much alignment there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. So we would